Hello, everybody. We're gonna wait a couple of minutes before we start. Okay, Time to start now. Hello, everyone, and welcome, everyone. Bienvenidos todas y todos. Bienvenidos and bienvenidas to our second seminar. We hope you enjoyed that fantastic Dominican music. And thank you very much for being here in our second seminar. For today's agenda, we have the presentation of our member, Sophia D'Angelo. And after that, we will have a Q&A section. Please, for your questions, send them in the chat, and our member, Sebastian Ansaldo, will organize the Q&A. If you feel more comfortable writing your question in Spanish or Portuguese, please feel free to do so, and we will translate them into English, because we are trying to do this space as trilingual as possible. After the presentation and the Q&A, we will have a second presentation in a more informal way, where our members Javiera Marfan and Ana Laura Trigo Clapes will present a little bit of the history of CLAREC and our experience on this collective. So I will introduce you now our speaker today, Sophia D'Angelo. Sophia D'Angelo recently finished her PhD from the Faculty of Education's Research in Equitable Access and Learning Center. Her ethnographic research uses diverse methods to explore how teachers and students perceive effective pedagogy in Dominican public schools. She has taught at the middle school and tertiary levels in the Dominican Republic, and has worked as a teacher trainer at the Dominican Republic Education and Mentoring Project, where she is currently leading a participatory action research project with adolescent girls to make a digital curriculum on sexual and reproductive health and gender-based violence. Dr. D'Angelo has also worked as a consultant for various international development agencies, including the World Bank, Chemonics, Overseas Development Institute, and the Tech Hub for projects in Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. Her work has a particular focus on issues of equity in education, including intersection of age, gender, disability, and immigration or refugee status. So we will now listen to Sophia's presentation. Over to you, Sophia.
Thank you, Consu. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for joining me today. I see a lot of familiar faces and not so familiar faces. So it's nice to see such a big group of people here. And special thanks to Professor Susan Robertson and Professor Ricardo Sabates again for joining us, as well as Bethan Morgan, who's been very, very inspirational in her work on student voice, which has really been influential in my own study. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and excuse the woodpeckers and dogs that you may hear in the background during this presentation, but I hope everything is clear. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Now I did just hand in my thesis and submit the corrections actually in November last month. So it's as a sort of a disclosure, this is really just going to be addressing a very small portion of my 300-page report dissertation. But in particular, I'm going to look at this concept of craft knowledge, which I think is very relevant for the work that we're doing in CLAREC, which is all about looking at local knowledge and indigenous knowledge and trying to center those voices of the more marginalized, especially from the region of Latin America. So to get started, I was a teacher for 4 years. I was going to get you guys all to answer this question, and I feel free to do it, though I'm not going to give you much time for logistical reasons, but interested to hear what you guys think is the most important factor to improve learning. So if you are feeling brave, throw in your answers, but if not, don't worry, you're off the hook today, because basically I'm going to give you the answer. The answer is the teacher, right? So the research shows that the teacher is usually the number one, has the most potential to improve teaching and learning, despite all factors aside, resources, financing, infrastructure, etc. It's the teacher who has the potential to improve teaching and learning. And as Konsu said in my biography, I did work as a teacher and teacher trainer in the Dominican Republic before coming to Cambridge for my master's in 2016. As an MPhil student at Cambridge, I focused my thesis on teacher professional development and wrote a literature review on effective teacher professional development for an NGO. And I'll never forget actually something that really caught my eye during that time. And there's the idea of reflective practice. And Donald Shawn talks about this, reflective practice for all practitioners, but particularly for teachers. It's this idea of, teachers learn through their practice and through thinking about their practice and reflecting on what worked, what didn't work, this kind of cycle of inquiry and reflection. It's an iterative process of trial and error, right? And through this process, I came across the concept of craft knowledge. So craft knowledge, and I'm just going to read a quick definition for you guys. But craft knowledge is defined as the professional knowledge which teachers acquire primarily through their practical experience in the classroom rather than their formal training, which guides their day-to-day actions in classrooms, right? So two important points stand out here to me. And one is that it's different than their formal training, right? So in your training, you learn certain concepts, but once you get into the classroom, all the kind of theory goes to the side, and you're really forced to learn through the experience and the realities in which you're working, the students' needs, the resources you have, etc. The other point is that it's what drives their practice. So when they're teaching, they're using this craft knowledge, not necessarily what's coming from a textbook. And when we look at this in terms of theory and concepts around teachers' knowledge, there's this kind of dichotomy between theoretical propositional knowledge, which conceptualize teaching as a science. So propositional knowledge, for those of you who know the work of Shulman, pedagogical knowledge, content knowledge, and pedagogical content knowledge, that's all what he considers propositional knowledge, right? And it's kind of science-based, research-based from the book, rather than practical knowledge, which is more contextualized, comes from practice, situated knowledge, which is situated in kind of the realities of the context, and sees teaching as more of a craft, right? And so that's more classroom-based, experiential-based. So to move on and give you a little bit of context of the Dominican Republic, in 2016, the Ministry of Education launched a new competency-based curriculum. And this has been a big trend in many developing nations to implement this competency-based curriculum, which employs what's called learner-centered pedagogy. It looks really at building student skills based on the skills that they have and kind of developing these new skills that will prepare them for the world. 3 years later, a Dominican organization wrote a report on the progress that the country is making towards the Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which is quality education. And what they found is that, they highlighted a couple very interesting points in terms of financing and governance and all that, but at a practical level, at the classroom level, in terms of pedagogy and classroom practices, they were saying that teachers still haven't appropriated the new curriculum and that they're still using traditional methods, quote unquote, with like copying, right? And we see this a lot again in the literature when we try and implement certain new reforms, especially reforms that come from the global north in Southern contexts. We see that there's this kind of pushback or misalignment. So again, this is kind of showing you how learner-centered in theory is what they want, but in practice, what they're saying is going on is teacher-centered. And then what's that showing is this gap between policy and practice. So I'm going to expand upon this a bit, but I take a different approach in my research, because rather than making assumptions, what Cooper and McIntyre say is that rather than making assumptions about what works across contexts, the starting point should be the attempt to understand what people in classrooms are trying to do and how they go about trying to do it effectively, right? And I really hold this to be true to my heart. I really think that this is important, and really trying to understand, teachers and students are the ones, most involved in these everyday practices, and we really need to try to center their voices and understand their experiences to be able to then make any changes and improvements. So just quickly, my 3 research questions. What are teachers and students' perceptions of effective teaching and learning in the context of the Dominican Republic? In what ways do these perceptions reveal themselves in everyday practices? And how do teachers perceive enablers and challenges to effective teaching and learning? So it really addresses, first the perceptions, their practices, and then the kind of, factors that either impede or promote those perceptions and practices. Methodologically, what that looks like is an ethnography. It's really trying to understand the world views of these people, of students and teachers in their context, their cultural context, and realities. I used a proposive sampling strategy because, again, as a building on strengths approach rather than a deficit approach, I really try to, understand what good teachers are doing and how they're doing it, right? So kind of, it started by trying to identify promising practices to be able to kind of disseminate that. The truth is the Dominican Republic does not have kind of a data system that can say, oh, this school is good and this school is not. So it was all done kind of by word of mouth, which ended up working well for an interesting comparative ethnography, as this presentation will show. Once I identified the two schools, I spoke with the principal, and she or he also had to identify two teachers that they saw as good at the 5th and 6th grade level. I chose fifth and 6th grade because these are the last years of primary going into secondary. And so it's a big transition year where a lot of students drop out, and so retention is a big issue. And so I really wanted to see that what good teachers were doing to serve groups in this age group. I worked with all of the students that those teachers taught. It ended up being 170 students from 9 to 15 years of age, which also I think goes to show you about the kind of classroom conditions and context in which these teachers are working. A 15-year-old in 5th grade next to a 9-year-old, that's a very, very specific dynamic that they're working with. Now I don't have time to go into my methods too much, but it is important to remember this idea of reflection. And I use diverse methods, and this presentation is going to draw a lot on the interview data I used and the classroom observations particularly, because after every observation, I kind of sat with teachers and I reflected with them, and I used what's called stimulated recall. So stimulated recall interviews are really trying to understand teacher sense-making processes. And as the name of this method implies, it literally involves me sitting next to the teacher, recalling what I observed in the observation. I would just write down as much as I saw, not interpret it, but just descriptive of like, this happened, you used this material, you said this to the student, and I would sit back with them and ask, why did you do this? Why did you speak this way? Or why did you say this? Or why did you use these materials? What do you know about this student that would make you do this, et cetera? What do you know about the curriculum that would make you do this? Or how did you learn this practice, et cetera? So it's really trying to understand their sense-making processes, how they make decisions in the classroom, and the kind of the practical knowledge that they've come up with. The two schools I worked with were both on the North Coast. On the left, you'll see the school in Puerto Plata, the province of Puerto Plata. I call it Larimar School. So because this was more of an urban community, it was quite different in that students had a little more, they came from more diverse socioeconomic levels, I would say, or class levels. So they had a little bit more opportunity, rather than on the right, in Maria Trinidad Sanchez, the first school site I worked at, which was Taino School, which was very rural. It was further away from, district bodies or the Ministry of Education. The uniforms promised by the Ministry of Education had not arrived. They had less resources, et cetera. So again, this is when we talk about, knowledge that comes from context and experience. These are important factors to keep in mind as I present my findings. So I'm gonna jump right into it. And I just draw on 3 important findings that kind of, illustrate this idea of craft knowledge. But the first one is the fact that craft knowledge differs across schools, though within schools, teachers and students have similar perceptions of effectiveness. And for people who know the work of Donald McIntyre in terms of craft knowledge, he actually found this as well in terms that, students and teachers, you might think that students and teachers see things differently, but they actually tend to agree on quite a lot, especially in terms of the end product of what they want good teaching and learning to be, although they may not always agree with the means by which that end product is achieved, which I also found in my study. So I thought this was really interesting, though, because one thing that was different than the craft knowledge research I've read is this differences across schools. And it was really, there are stark differences across schools. A lot of the time when we talk about comparative pedagogy or comparative education, we think about, between rural and urban, or we think about national contexts or something like this. But even just an hour and a half away, these two schools, there were really, major differences. So overall, all teachers and students kind of describe these 4 roles of effective teachers, and they fell into the role of the professional, which addresses issues of, you know, logistical and administrative issues, arriving on time, fulfilling your duties, you know, attending meetings, etc., completing your lesson plans. Curriculum implementer is just as it sounds, implementing the curriculum and transforming the curriculum into tangible teaching and learning activities, and evaluating the students based on the curriculum, you know, goals and indicators, etc. Disciplinarian, which touches on the, you know, classroom management strategies. And then role model, which is about instilling values in your students, either, you know, through your actions or by word, which also was another difference across schools. So another thing that, you know, my research kind of centers, and this, I think this illustration, you know, depicts it quite well, is that pedagogy is both, you know, teaching and learning is both an affective and technical process, right? So you have these more technical duties and roles as a professional or as the actual teaching and instructional methods, but they're very affective, social, socio-emotional and relational aspects as well. And that's when you get into play with the disciplinary and how to foster relationships with students, how to instill these values, etc. So the way that these four roles were conceptualized and prioritized across the two schools was quite different, but really I'm going to focus on the idea of the disciplinarian to give you that, you know, to exemplify this. Taino school, the school that was in the rural setting, had a huge emphasis on discipline, and the two teachers that I spoke with at that school, who I refer to them through their pseudonyms of Miguel and Samuel, they both emphasize since the very first day when I asked them, you know, what makes a good teacher or what are your strengths, it was all about discipline and carácter. Carácter, which literally translates as character, but in the Dominican Republic, at least, there's a very certain, it means certain type of character, which is like a demeanor that demands respect, right? So for them, an effective teacher was able to discipline the class and demand respect from students. So as Miguel said in his first interview, as the Japanese phrase goes, education is really placed on discipline, right? This was like a first priority. It was a certain type of discipline. Samuel called it a functional discipline, which is like a discipline that's important to set the stage for teaching and learning, right? Another quote. So interestingly, Miguel said he didn't always have this character. He wasn't always able to you know, discipline the students or have this kind of control over the students, and that he learned it through classroom practice. So he said, I started to develop little by little a discipline, rules, and a character that the kids who used to be annoying did not only respect me, but they also obeyed me. They feared me. It was not a fear as in being scared, but rather a fear of respect. So much that those kids who before did not go to class in line, now they walked in line to go to the cafeteria. Now they walked in line to go to the flag, and to go home they walked in line. And they did not leave the classroom when the bell rang until I gave them the order. And if I left the room, they all remained sitting up straight. The whole class remained silent. So two things I want to call attention to. First is that it seems like a kind of a crazy dynamics in terms of, you know, children who fear this teacher, one, and two, in the type of discipline that they're implying, right? That you're sitting up straight, that you're quiet, that you're walking in lines, exactly, etc. So it's a very specific type of discipline and order. And I remember seeing this in the school too. You know, there are times where Miguel was about to walk into the class and teachers and the students were like, oh my God, here comes Miguel, you know, and they're running into the class to get down, to sit up straight and be quiet because they know that he's coming, and there could be repercussions if they aren't in order. But at the same time, students recognize this, and the majority agree that Miguel and Samuel were the two best teachers at the 5th and 6th grade level, right? And just, I have a bunch of quotes from students. I wish I could show you more, but just one by Jen Delis, for example, a student in 6th grade. She says, in math class, which is Miguel's class, students sit up straight. With other teachers, the kids get crazy, and when Profe Miguel arrives, they sit up straight and get completely silent. You know, and another girl talked about how she likes math class because in the other class she gets a headache because students are loud. And another little boy said, you know, the science teacher is good, she explains well, but the students talk all the time, so I can't hear her, right? So again, the students also recognize that this kind of functional discipline was important for teaching and learning, and they appreciated it when teachers were able to keep the class in order. And you know, a lot of them actually spoke about how they didn't feel as safe in other classes. And, you know, I would sometimes see what seemed kind of like coercive and very, you know, authoritarian disciplining strategies. But again, what the kids were telling me and what the teacher was telling me too is that it's better for the teacher to use that kind of language to keep order in the class than to not, because otherwise the students feel safer in a class when the teacher's, you know, yelling at a student than in a class where the teacher doesn't have control over the students and they fear that a student may bully them or treat them wrong. So the interesting also thing is that this was also, you know, seen at the school level. So I spoke to the principal at each school, and these are the words of Cindy, the school principal, pseudonym Cindy. She said, "I don't like to hold up many of the school staff members because I don't like to lose my personality. I'm a person who gets along with everyone. I like to play around with others. But being a school leader, it's like one has to have a different type of carácter than the one I have. I get along with everyone. I don't like to speak badly to others because I don't like when they speak badly to me." So again, this idea of carácter and speaking badly is the carácter is that when you demand respect, you have to get a little tough sometimes, right? And she's seeing how this is important at the school level, being a school leader, that you also have to be tough with your staff and make sure that teachers are doing what they're supposed to be. And that's, you know, we talk about accountability systems in education. And what she's saying, I mean, it was just fascinating how, again, she used the word carácter as well, when the word carácter did not come up in the second school that I worked with at all in the data, until one point when I myself probed about why teachers need to get tough. And the teacher replied with, "Oh yeah, sometimes you have to have carácter." So it was really, really fascinating. And it just goes to show you that at the school level as well, there's this, you know, there's a mirroring of what is effective based on school context and situation. In addition, when we talk about school structure, oh, an important point also, Cindy had 2 years of experience, which also obviously plays a role compared to the other school leader who had 7+ years of experience. So Cindy also talked about how, you know, she took on this role because no one else really wanted to. And I think that, of course, you know, plays a role in her ability to build this carácter and to do her job effectively. But the rotating school structure also plays a really important role. Now, this was different because in this school, in Taino school, 5th and 6th grade teachers were rotating. So there were 4 classrooms and they rotated across these 4 classrooms, which meant a lot in terms of space and power and control of the space, right? Because the students are sitting in the class the whole day. That is their space, and a teacher must come into the room and kind of control the class and foster a certain environment or classroom ethos. I saw on several occasions students actually block teachers from walking into the room, you know, and also I saw how students, if one teacher left and the other teacher didn't arrive right away, how even within those 2 or 3 minutes, there was a lot of, you know, disorder, etc. And both teachers spoke to this. Miguel, for example, had experience in both, and he talked about the positive aspects of being a set teacher, because, you know, you can control the class and there's consistency across. And that's what brings me to my second school to compare with Larimar School. And with Larimar School did have set teachers, right? So it's very different. These are, you know, one 5th grade teacher with her 5th grade class all day, and a 6th grade teacher with her 6th grade class all day. So it's, you know, again, there's this consistency. You can make rules and expectations and enforce them, you know, throughout the day. And again, there's almost this kind of camaraderie and like family dynamics that it's able to develop through this, you know, consistency throughout the day and throughout the year. And having this like teacher as the, you know, the mother-father figure. So when we talk about school leader and structure as well, the school principal had learned specific strategies, and this is where craft knowledge comes into play. Even at the, you know, at the school leader, through the school leader, he had learned in his 7 years that violence was an issue. School violence and discipline was an issue here, but he learned these strategies. So throughout the whole schoolyard, he had asked local painters to come in and paint board games on the school benches, or hopscotch courses around the schoolyard. And he did this to mitigate, you know, conflict. And he explains this, you know, now children leave classrooms to play for recess, and when there are 2 playing chess or parcheesi, there are another 8 or 10 that are watching. So then you are fragmenting the possibility of those students being idle during recess. They bump into each other and then they look to fight each other. So again, I think this is really interesting because he had learned these strategies through his own practice, 7 years as a director. And it had really decrease the incidence of violence. Another thing that he did, for example, was instead of having, in Taino school, they had like a 2-hour lunch period where after eating, kids were just allowed to run around and play outside, usually unsupervised. But what Carlos did instead was after they would eat, they would go back into their rooms with their teachers. Their teachers would supervise them in the class. They were allowed to play board games or cards or listen to music or watch a movie on the computer if the teacher had a computer, etc. So, or they were allowed to rest, right? So again, he's learning these strategies to mitigate violence. And it goes back to training, right? And the sort of theoretical training that teachers get in their pre-service education. And Samuel, who was one of the teachers who struggled most with kind of controlling student behavior or classroom management, he spoke of his pre-service training as being inadequate and very theoretical and not practical. So he said educators talk to you about strategies, but in a very superficial way, because they paint everything all beautiful. They don't tell you that some little guy fulano is going to intervene 5 times and he's going to stand up and throw a piece of paper, right? So again, we see this, there's a lot of research about how teacher education or teacher training, if it's not linked to practice, it's very ineffective. So just in general, some other strategies that they learned that through their craft knowledge that they constructed, playing games and competitions in which points were awarded for good behavior. Miguel did this really well. It was amazing to see how the class would change from, students competing and being loud and rowdy to all of a sudden being quiet because they really wanted to win and points were taken off for, noise or speaking out of turn. Samuel, what he would do is he would bring a poster board in. He would write all the notes beforehand on a poster board and, tape this up in the various classrooms that he worked in. And he learned to do this because otherwise, when he had to turn his back on students and write on the board, that, them being unsupervised just for a moment would cause a little bit of a ruckus or mayhem. So, another strategy that he learned through practice. They don't teach you this in your pre-service education. And avoiding disciplinary issues by not using certain materials. And this is really, again, when we talk about the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge, this teacher, she goes by her pseudonym is Gloria, and she was from Larimar School. She spoke often about how, you can use resources and materials to motivate learners. They really enjoy that, or visuals to make learning more accessible. And I'll touch on that a bit later, but the issue was that even though she knew that this was effective in theory, in practice, it was almost impossible to do because there were certain materials that students would use as weapons. This example, for example, was they were just using like rocks or pebbles to manipulate to learn math and other operations, and they would start throwing them. So again, something that in theory may seem like it's going to work doesn't always translate in practice. So we're starting to see then at the school level how these various factors shape teachers' and school leaders' perceptions of effective teaching and learning. So Taino school focused a lot more on this idea of discipline because they had more challenges at the school and classroom level. Larimar school, on the other hand, was able to, they were able, both teachers and students spoke more of dynamic teaching and learning activities, and they really focused more on that curriculum implementer since discipline wasn't as much of an issue, right? Craft knowledge talks a lot about how it's based on problem solving, and in Taino school, discipline was a lot more of a problem. So moving forward, the second finding was copying as a pedagogical strategy was used both sparingly and strategically. And I want to call attention again to this report where it was like, 3 years after the launch of the competency-based curriculum, teachers are still using traditional teaching methods. They haven't appropriated the new curriculum, right? Again, putting the fault on teachers. But what I found with at least the 4 teachers that I worked with is that they recognize copying as an ineffective strategy, and when it's excessive, right? When long excessive texts are copied, they know students aren't going to learn like that. However, they did still resort to copying as a pedagogical strategy, sparingly and strategically. And I'll explain a little bit about when and why and why they use it, right? A lot of it was asking, why are you doing this? And what I found was because teachers were simply evaluated on student work. They spoke of technicals that would come into their classrooms and evaluate their job as teachers based on the work that they saw in students' notebooks or posted on the walls, right? So a lot of the production of written work was almost kind of to defend themselves. and prove that they're working on whichever content of the curriculum that they were, in a timely fashion, because técnicos would come into the schools, one-off visits, real quick superficial assessment of what we see on the walls and what we see in the books, and that's what they would be judged off. So of course, it's kind of this parallel system where we see if teachers are being evaluated off of that, then they're also going to be implementing these certain practices in the classroom. Second, there weren't textbooks that were aligned to the curriculum. So the curriculum was launched in 2016, remember, and I conducted my fieldwork in 2018 to 2019. And still to this day, 2020, I hear that there are still no textbooks that are aligned to the curriculum, right? So writing in students' notebook, teachers often refer to the notebook as their material de apoyo, their support material, or a biblioteca, their own library, right? Because they were writing in their textbooks, in their notebooks, to bring this information back home and to study from it. And it's interesting because when we talk about ethnography, we always talk about putting our preconceptions aside. And at first I was, seeing this copying, and I admit, I was like, oh gosh, they're just copying. And I would ask students, do you guys learn from copying? And they're like, no. And I was like, see, I knew it, but no, actually, then I was starting to see the other side of it, right? I started seeing how, some students who did study from home were like, no, yeah, it does help me. I bring it home and I study from it. I mean, it makes sense, right? If they don't have textbooks to bring home, they don't have any reading or literacy materials, period. What else are they going to study from, right? And you saw it, I also started seeing it during classrooms where students were asked to recall information by looking in their notebooks. So again, this act of copying became kind of their way of creating their own textbooks, their own personal textbooks or study materials to bring home and study from. And finally, teachers' pedagogical content knowledge does play a role. Again, I spoke about how teachers had to transform the curriculum into kind of tangible teaching and learning activities. And a lot of the time they did this through using materials or resources or visuals or drawing on students' experiences. But for certain content, they did struggle to do this. And that's where teachers' pedagogical content knowledge plays a role, right? Because, for example, for grammar or definitions, they didn't really find kind of practical or visual ways of making this real for students. So they did see copying as a way of kind of making it tangible, or at least visible, I would say. But so what we're beginning to see is, again, how now not only does the institutional level matter and the school level matter, but the policy environment level matters and the individual level matters as well, right? Teachers' knowledge and teachers' skills. So when we consider the material and political systems which teaching occurs, the act of copying becomes a learning-centered strategy. And O'Sullivan talks about this in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, but it's not learner-centered necessarily, but within the context and the political realities and the institutional realities and material realities, copying is seen as an important act towards learning that will facilitate learning, if not directly, then indirectly. And finally, finding 3 is the use of song, dance, and movement, which were important strategies used to set the tone of the class. And this was, again, when I was first, I would see these dances and songs and little activities. We call them dinámicas here in the Dominican Republic. And I always wanted to, I always wanted to them to connect it to the lesson, right? I wanted to see them really make it about the content and the curriculum. But I started realizing more and more that maybe it doesn't need to be for this to be a really important and effective strategy in the grand scheme of things, right? Students often referred to these dinámicas as fun activities, and though they were unrelated to the curriculum, they served to re-energize students. As one 6th grade girl, Luth, in Larimar School recalled, it made her feel new. And this is when the literature plays a role, which Weisberth, in her discussion of learner-centered pedagogy, she says, activities which appear to be simple and not particularly educational routines can help frame lessons and bring learners into the experience in an orchestrated way. And I definitely found that all of my teachers used dance and music to a certain extent. And it was important, as if we talk about teaching and learning as a cognitive and socio-emotional or a technical and affective aspect, you really, to get students motivated and energized and enthusiastic, then this is all, and important in the grand scheme of things. So in conclusion, to summarize, why is this important? Well, Methodologically, it centers teachers and students' voices, and it recognizes them as reflexive and thoughtful actors capable of providing important insights to research on effective teaching and learning. A lot of research on teacher effectiveness is, very top down, and this is something that is bottom up. And to my knowledge, it's the first study in the Dominican Republic where the researcher doesn't only observe teachers, but then they sit with the teachers afterwards and ask them to reflect and explain, why they made certain decisions, and really kind of examines or explores their sense-making processes. Second, it problematizes the polarization of teacher-centered and learner-centered pedagogy. And there's a lot more literature coming out, Vavris, Robin Alexander, Bartlett, on how it shouldn't be either or teacher-centered or learner-centered, right? We have to consider the material and contextual and cultural realities, and maybe find a common ground in the middle, a blend of the sorts, or what O'Sullivan calls learning-centered strategies, which may not appear learner-centered at first. And finally, it situates teaching and learning into a pedagogical nexus. So this pedagogical nexus is showing the connection, right? Teaching does not happen in isolation, right? So it recognizes the cultural, material, social, and political realities that shape teaching and learning. So I will end there. Thank you very much. Hope I didn't go too fast, but I'm open to all questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia, for such a great presentation. This was really interesting and also very clear, so thank you. I will start with a question from Leona, but I also will build something about that, because she asked about that she's interested to know to what extent the specific context of the Dominican Republic impacts here. What is the social demography of these schools regarding race or ethnic and class? Also, does gender play a part? And I was thinking about this big issue in Latin and Caribbean countries about inequalities, and how that might affect we know that affect the results and teachers' practices and learning. So what can you tell us about these inequalities and the specific context of the schools that you were immersed to?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you very much. And actually on Saturday, I lied to you all because I said that this was my first time presenting as Dr. D'Angelo, but I forgot I had to present on Saturday, which I did in the Dominican Studies Association conference. And it was, I spoke about issues of equity a bit because yes, it came up a lot. And I have a whole chapter on that unfortunately I wasn't able to go on here, but please reach out to me and we can continue the discussion. Teachers' perceptions of their students was really important, and they came out as a big element shaping their perceptions of teaching and learning, right? So gender played a role. There were a lot of implicit biases towards girls, but also boys. In the Dominican Republic, boys are actually, stats show that the boys are performing less than girls and attending school less than girls. So they're actually more at risk of dropping out, et cetera. And you saw this in my study, how boys, it comes down to notions of masculinity and how they were, they faced a lot of kind of hyperpunitive disciplinary approaches, et cetera. Also, students of Haitian descent, of course, anyone with knowledge of the Dominican Republic, there's always that factor that plays a huge role. So there was a lot of othering of Haitian students, and the Haitian students themselves taught like all of them except for one admitted to being discriminated by peers or teachers, being told really, rude words, etc. Oh, and ratiolinguistic. If you're going to look up something, ratiolinguistic ideology is really interesting because what one of the Spanish teachers did was that they had a ratiolinguistic ideology is when you kind of conflate the idea of race with linguistic ability. So they would associate that the Haitian students who are racialized, right? It's an ethnicity that is racialized in the Dominican context, but they would associate just their identity itself with the idea that they were incapable of speaking Spanish, even though I was listening to them the whole time and they spoke Spanish just as much as the other Dominicans, because these were Haitians born and raised in the Dominican Republic, right? So gender played a role, race played a role, ethnicity played a role, but also age played a role. And this is where the work of Monique Morris and the book Push Out comes into play, because she talks about this concept of age compression, where kids are assigned adult-like characteristics, or they're expected to act older than they are. And so there were some students that were overage, or even the students, you know, that were 11 or 12, they were expected to already know better. They were expected to have, you know, have this kind of attitude towards learning. And if they weren't, they were really punished for that, right? They kind of forgot that between the ages of 9 and 15 each year, psychological, you know, and physiological development is very different for these students. And they kind of ignored those nuances and grouped all kids into this kind of age compressed perspective. So that's very brief, but feel free to reach out. I'm always interested in talking about issues of equity, especially in the Dominican Republic. So.
Thank you, Sophia. Maybe a question about conceptualization is from Professor Ricardo Sabates, and it's about how do you understand learning? How was effective defined in terms of the effective learning?
Yeah.
Because I heard you talking about effective or good. How was learning defined?
Yeah, great question. Gracias, Ricardo. So the teachers perceived effectiveness very much in terms of student motivation and participation. And it kind of goes back to the idea that they saw students as very uninterested overall. Their perceptions of youth, Dominican youth today, was very much like, oh, they're not responsible, they don't really care about learning, etc. So their idea of when their class was effective, at the end of every observation, I would ask them, you know, did you think it was successful, or what was the learning objective, and did you think it was achieved? And every time they said yes, they only said no like 2 times, but they always said to a certain extent. So it was never 100% inclusive, 1, and 2, it was always based on very for lack of a better word, superficial or observational, you know, the impression they got from student participation, whether it was them raising their hands, going to the board, or writing in their notebook. And it was interesting because I ended up interviewing the director, a ministry leader in educational evaluation. And she said that they did a huge large-scale survey where they see the same thing, that teachers are very much focused on tareas, right? The little tasks that they have to do in completing these tasks, rather than significant kind of deep learning. And that's one thing that they are working on at the ministry level, is to improve these kind of evaluation systems. So thank you, Ricardo.
Great, thank you, Sophia. We have another question also about contextual issues, but more about the national level. Eva Hayes asks, why choose the Dominican Republic as a case study? What do we learn from a focus on this context? Because there's a huge disconnect in the Dominican Republic between national education government policy and how is this implemented experience on the ground. I wondered, you had considered some of the socio-historical political reasons that might impact teaching methodologies. I read this as an Dominicanist who worked for UNICEF in the DR. The problems with education are systemic and deeply linked to complex problems with race, class, gender, politics, etc. None of which you appear to mention in your talk.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Eve. I actually know Eve, so I'll give you a hard time later, Eve. No, I'm just kidding. But I did talk. So I talked about race, class, gender now. So I'm going to bypass that area. What do we learn from a focus on the context? There's a huge disconnect in the DR between national education government policy and how it's implemented. Exactly. Right. That's my whole point. Right. There's this huge disconnect. That's what the first 2 reports I showed with the competency-based curriculum versus the report 3 years later that's saying, oh, we're not actually implementing how we want. But my whole study is like, well, that's why we need to listen to the teachers, and that's why we have to see how they perceive teaching and learning and their understandings of it and their context and the realities in which they work. The competency-based curriculum is all based on Jean Piaget and all these European theorists, and it's very disconnected from the realities. There's nothing on, you know, overage students and students with learning difficulties in that curriculum. There's nothing on ethnic minorities in that curriculum. There's nothing on classroom management in that curriculum. So yeah, I think I agree there's a huge disconnect. And the reason I chose the DR is because I have 10 plus years, you know, working in education in this system. So, but even in the public schools, you see, and across public schools, it's a very different context. So I think it's important. And I would love to, you know, see similar studies done wider to see what the differences are across within the nation, because I think within the nation, of course, there are a lot of differences based on regions, etc. So I'm not sure if I answered all of your questions, Eve, but I'm sure we could touch base after this talk as well to continue. She gave me a thumbs up, so.
Sophia, and we have another question, maybe about the structure or accountability, I think, and it's from Dirk. I'm interested in how teachers make sense of the accountability structures they inhabit. On the one hand, your participants clearly had some non-textbook strategies they found to be helpful, and on the other hand, it seems like the authorities will have disagreed with some of those strategies. How did this discrepancy tension play out, if at all, in teachers' reflection with you?
Yeah, that's interesting. Nice question. Thanks, Dirk, and good to see you. Unfortunately, accountability system, this was actually one of my recommendations at the end of my thesis, because I didn't really see much about accountabilities at all, both at a school level, well, at least in one of the schools where we talked about this, the teacher having a lot less experience, the school leader having a lot less experience, but also at, a subnational or national level in terms of districts and the Ministry of Education, which didn't really, like I said, even the supervision process itself was very superficial, and there were very, the policy environment has been fluctuating quite a bit over the past, 4 or 5 years, and teachers talked about that too, right? How they're always, introducing a new lesson plan format or a new curriculum or a new, now metacognition is the new boom, as one of the teachers described it. So they're always kind of trying, implement these new, what we do and what we see a lot in, global northern context, but there's no follow-up. It's very ad hoc training, and it's not, systemic, and there aren't really accountability systems, right? So there is this kind of trade-off and incongruencies across schools. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Sophia. Maybe this is not a question, but a comment from Susan. Really interesting, and congratulations, your finding that is not teacher-centered versus learner-centered, but a matter of craft knowledge as to when each was best deployed. I also agree that this is a really interesting position on not to do this polarization between practices or knowledge is something contextual. So I thought that really thoughtful and interesting. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
No, I think, yeah, I think that's, and like I said, I found it so fascinating to see how craft knowledge varied across schools that were just an hour and a half away, and how, teachers and students can really they have similar perceptions, but perceive it so differently. And how, again, it's nothing like what we read in books. These aren't things that you learn in your pre-service training or in a textbook. It's really just what they developed through their own experience in the classroom. So yeah, thank you. Who was that comment from, though, Sebastian? Was that yours, or are you reading that from the chat?
I was reading from Susan Robertson.
Ah, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. I think we have almost all our inquiries addressed. We have to keep going with our presentation. Now we have a little reflection and presentation from Javiera and Anna about the history of CLAREC. So thank you very much, Sophia.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Sorry, I was mute. Hello, everyone. Now let's try to do it. Okay. Are you seeing me now? Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah. Well, we dedicated a couple of minutes of this meeting to tell you about the story of CLAREC. We thought first to tell you about the history of CLAREC, but this is more kind of a story. So I hope you enjoyed it, and you can get a little to know a little bit more about us and this project. Well, this first part of the history of CLAREC is about our experience as Latino students at the faculty, and is Therefore, it's very biographical, so it may not reflect the experience that every one of us has had as a PhD student at the faculty, and may not apply to all the members of CLAREC. But I think that to some extent, everyone in the collective can relate to this experience from their own histories. So when we entered the PhD, we all found a very welcoming and supportive environment. Nevertheless, coming from a different cultural and language background posed some difficulties to us. Difficulties that shown, for example, in when giving an opinion, we were never sure about if we were expressing what we meant with precision or in a way that was acceptable in the English manners and culture. For example, I remember I once was at a very smart dinner at my college and we were talking informally about clothing, and I kept talking about pants, trying to say pantalon, until someone told me, you may want to say trousers because in the British context, you're talking about underwear. And that kind of experiences applied to all this sense of insecureness of the first months and maybe years. I was 2 years here in Cambridge when that thing happened, anecdote. Other example of the difficulties that we face is that when we try to write in English, we write in a different style that here is considered too wordy. And for us, being straightforward in writing sometimes seemed a little bit rude, so it's difficult to adapt. And I could provide a lot of examples of how being unaware of the higher education dynamics in the United Kingdom and what are the expectations both over us presents challenges. And all these challenges are things that we had to make sense of and to reflect on them and adapt. Besides everything else was new, the faculty and the college, but also the city, the landscape, the EP, cycling, the groceries. I remember that in my first week, I walked around the streets taking photos of everything, every building, the parks, the swans, the squirrels, and even the traffic signs seemed so different to me that I took photos to send to my family. It soon also became clear that Latin America was not participating in the faculty's research agenda. Even though there were academic groups and research projects focused on educational inequalities in the Global South, they tended to focus on other contexts. But I was not aware of any project conducted in Latin America. There were not many Latin American academics at the faculty too, besides Ricardo Sabates, of course, who I must say has always been very supportive with Latin American students and all our causes. So what happened is that each one of us in different spaces of the faculty began to search for other Latin American students to exchange opinions and questions that we could phrase in our own language, and in more general to support each other into navigating the doctoral process. For some of us who entered the PhD in 2017, that space was made by a group of Mexican and Chilean women classmates from the first and the third year, and we began to meet regularly, both for social and academic purposes. And with the years, we became close friends, and we began to integrate other newly arrived Latin American students into this friendship/peer support group.
Okay, and as Javiera says, we just didn't have to get used to being in a different country with a different cultural background and a different university like this one, like the University of Cambridge, with different, that they even have their own words that we might not be aware of until you get here. We started also interacting in our own research groups in the field of our expertise. So here we have our own experience and our own knowledge that we have developed from before, from whatever context we developed it. But then we find the opportunity to bring different ideas. this is our opportunity to also bring this like diversity and refer back to work that has been done in Latin America and contribute to the faculty in general. And we've been lucky as well that in all of our research groups, we ended up finding some Latino students or some Latino researchers. And we tended to get together, and it was a great opportunity to discuss maybe the meetings that we had the same day or readings that we're having in our research groups, and allowed us to even practice the way we're going to present to others later on, or to even conduct reliability tests of our own findings, because we had the same language and the same cultural background to do it. So as Javi was saying, like, it was just not the social accompanying and the well-being of being together as friends, but we started noticing the value of knowing other Latin American students and researchers that we could discuss research with. And the next one, and beyond the faculty as well. We also had colleges events and our events in scholarship programs that we're part of. For example, this photo, we're in the Trust, in the Cambridge Trust event. Every year they have one in the museum. And those were other opportunities where we get the chance to not only talk about social aspects of our experience in the University of Cambridge, but we also get the opportunity to share our research, to get to know what the others are doing, because maybe we're not part of the same research group, or maybe we're doing in different countries. But in that moment, you realize how important and how we can support each other or enrich our research. And also how our perspectives as Latin American researchers can also enrich other groups, like in the other photo with Alex. You get to know people from other countries that might not know proposals or theory that has been developed in Latin America, and that's our chance to also contribute back. Next one, Javi.
Well, during 2019, some of us began to participate in support of a variety of social movements. The Chilean students participated in a series of meetings to make visible the social uprising that was happening in Chile. The Latinas group, this group of friends and academic peer support, organized a performance called A Rape is on Your Path that was attended by several other women from Latin America, but also from other countries, to make visible gender violence. We marched to denounce the climate crisis. We marched in support of Black Lives Matter. But in all those instances, we began to meet each other more regularly. And we started a discussion about our role as Latin American students at the faculty, but also the social responsibility that we have, being at Cambridge with our Latin American origins. So one day, one of this group decided to put these informal conversations into something concrete. And they convocated a meeting in February 2020 to organize a seminar in which all the graduate students related to Latin America could present their research, so we can get to know each other and what we were researching. And that meeting led to the definition of this group as a collective, and it posed the long-standing purpose of making visible the Latin American context at the faculty and contributing to bridge research conducted in Cambridge with the one that is being done in Latin America. Well, unfortunately, coronavirus interrupted our plans and we had to cancel that seminar. Nevertheless, this group remained active during the pandemic, but in the format again of informal conversations. Our focus was supporting each other's well-being and discuss research redefinitions that we were making due to the changing circumstances posed by the pandemic.
Well, now this Michaelmas term in November, actually, we started to get together again, because we still had the idea that it was valuable to create something with a group of people that we already know each other. And we had this idea of the seminar, but we wanted to make it into something bigger that might actually transcend. So we started to take concrete actions. We had some meetings with a group of friends that we developed, and even with more people than before. And we are all very committed to develop these activities. So we actually had to take these actions to define and establish what we mean with this collective. So it involves elaborating an official manifesto or a presentation statement to share our goals with others, especially with this aim that we have to make visible the region's knowledge production, debates linked to education research towards the diversification and decolonization of academia as well. We had to coordinate a stance as a collective regarding aspects in Latin American identity, issues that should be addressing research and education, and knowledge production in higher education. So we had lots of meetings where we ourselves are questioning our own ideas and our own identity, and just try to create this like common understanding for the group. We also delineated the kind of activities we want to organize. So we started with ideas of presenting our work, as you have seen with this presentation and the previous one. And we might come up with reading groups and other events to start like more discussions with other people within the faculty and outside the university as well. We had our first event, just very quickly in the previous one, in the first event a month ago, where Consuelo presented her work, her PhD work. And the manifesto was read in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. I think this was a great statement from us, from CLAREC, just to show that we want to bring this visibility to other voices and to be aware that even though most of the research might be done in English, we also want to be inclusive of other voices. Now, the next one. And you can see in this photo was taken after the first event, and see the excitement in all of our faces. We are really excited with the work and to be able to create this group for Latin American researchers and for other students that might be really interested in research in Latin America. We're excited about the interest that other people have shown about it within the faculty and even outside. People are like contacting us, they're interested in getting involved. And also we have so many potential goals now that we see that there's an interest from others to actually join us. And that's how this event today was planned as well, with Sophia's presentation. The next one. So this just to say, our group is a work in progress. It has gone from a social group to a more academic. It remains social as well. I think we have both of them as important parts of our group. And we are as members, we're constantly reflecting and deconstructing our ideas of Latin America and educational research as we participate in the group. So we keep evolving, and we want to include other people's voices in that evolution and construction of knowledge about identity in Latin America and research to bring visibility as well. So these are just many ideas that Javiera and I wanted to present to you in a brief way, but other members, of course, have other experiences and other ideas to share. So we invite you to read our new, it's kind of a blog post, but in our website, we have a piece called CLAREC, How We Came Together, where other people wrote some of their anecdotes and their experiences with the group. And thank you, that's it. You can visit it in our website.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna and Sophia, for that wonderful account. And thank you so much to Sophia for your presentation. We will finish now. Apologies to everyone that I forgot to mention at the beginning that we are recording this session to upload it in our website. I'm so sorry about that, but if you have a problem with that, please send us a message. This is our last event for this term, but we are planning several other presentations for next term with presentations from our members and guest speakers. And we will also have a reading group where everyone is very welcome. So please follow us in our social media accounts so you can get the updates for our future activities. Thank you everyone for your comments and your questions, and thank you for engaging with our collective. We are very happy to have everyone here today. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Ciao, everybody.
Ciao.
Hola, Lía. Felicitaciones a las presentadoras.
Sí, bueno.
Really well.
Oh, where's Sophia?
Where's Sophia gone?
Yeah.